Welcome and thank you for tuning in. So the authenticity modality is a perspective that we want to acquaint ourselves with in our practice of mindfulness-based anxiety reduction. The authenticity modality is associated with the meditative placement of attention. Why? Because of the suspension of jumping to conclusions, the reduction of the practice of judgment. When I think about the authenticity mode, I recall Popeye's slogan, I am as I am, and that's all that I am. I am Popeye, the sailor man. I am as I am, and that's all that I am. I am Popeye, the sailor man. So you're getting a message about the authenticity modality. It does not reach for ideals. It is radically self-accepting, and it is also radically accepting of our circumstance. And when we think about ourself, we recognize that the self does not exist outside the context of an environment. So what we are, the self, is not isolated within a body. A body alone does not exist. It must have a context. So the environment and our bodies constitute what we know to be ourselves. So that's a very critical understanding, because it has a great deal to do with the meditative placement of attention. The meditative placement of attention is a non-dual perspective, and let me explain that. In other words, we have a way of looking at our experience, that life is happening to us. That is the dualistic way of looking at it. The other way of looking at the same field is to recognize that life is just happening. Okay, so if you're not too familiar with this type of conversation, let me just remind you about the lucid dreaming metaphor. You know, when we're dreaming and we become lucid, we recognize that the perceiver in the dream and the environment are one and the same. You dreaming. That's what happens when we become lucid. When we dream, well, we're no longer the perceiver only. We're just as much the environment, and so we're somewhere in between that. The dreamer is the dream itself. That's how we access the dreamer. Same thing in this field of awareness. The infinite dreamer, an aspect of ourself that generates this experience, is implicit, and we commune with that aspect of ourself by letting go of the subject-object relationship. We enter a perspective of life just happening. And again, if you're not that familiar with this type of conversation, you're going to need to chew it over a bit to really sink into it and find this wonderful placement of attention in which we commune. We have communion with a more inclusive aspect of ourselves. And again, when we think of ourself, we are not thinking necessarily of a more inclusive aspect of our ego. That's not the point. We are so much more than this narrow spectrum of self-interest, social concerns. That modality that we identify a great deal with is certainly an aspect of ourselves, but it's a very narrow aspect of ourselves. We and our environment are one thing. No air, no light, and no water, no you. And we are the integration of self and environment. And that is an important pill to swallow. So let's practice now this modality. So let's think about the term modality. The modality, there are many modalities, ways of perceiving ourselves and our experience. We have mode states, and we can think about mode states. We can associate them with mood also. Mood. Why? Because of the affective state. One of the distinguishing qualities about any particular mode state is it has an affective signature. In other words, you have certain emotions and feelings in any particular mode state. Well, the authenticity mode state is a non-judgmental perspective. We suspend jumping to conclusions, and we suspend the editorial. We suspend language in the meditative placement of attention. In the authenticity mode, we are observers. We're able to listen, and it is not, it's an equivalent, if you will, of the meditative placement of attention. Let's practice it now. And what I'd like you to do is to gather your impressions of me and notice your judgments about me. So judge away. And when we judge, we think about perhaps how I could be and how I might improve my communications, and or perhaps you might consider my delivery to be quite ideal. So allow yourself to judge. Okay, got that? Very good. All right. So that was a mode state. Now you have a self-concept, a worldview, and values that you're engaging. And of course your affective state, and your intellect is active, and of course there is also memory involved. You're putting together your worldview in your judgment. So we're going to now modulate. Yes, we're going from mode to mode, and this is going to shift our mood also. And what I'd like you to do is to continue to look at the video, but suspend judgment towards me. And as you do that, I'd like you to come to your senses and expand on your suspension of judgment. I'm doing the same thing. And listen very closely to your environment, wherever you are. And allow this to just be happening. Remain alert. So you can see the attention moves off the video. We become very sensory oriented when we suspend judgment. Suspend language also. Now this is associated with authenticity. It is as it is. I am as I am, and that's all that I am. And we realize the relationship between trust and the meditative placement of attention. We have to trust the universe to some extent. We have to trust life to be able to let go and to move to this modality of being. The authenticity modality. So in this modality, we are visited by thoughts. However, those thoughts are organized a bit differently. We don't run with them. They do not necessarily trigger further thoughts. We tend to let them go. And this is a very critically important skill set. Why? It has everything to do with the liberation from psychological suffering. Why? Because mode states are also generated by our emotional wounds. Our emotional wounds tend to produce fixations, and they have a tendency to repeat and to generate realities that are associated with our earlier frustrations, with our earlier disappointments. And these earlier disappointments can produce schema that tend to repeat. Why? They generate a defense. We defend ourselves against that, and in generating a defense against the memory, we produce the condition. So the liberation from psychological suffering is very associated with what we have just done. We have modulated. We have done a mental activity. It's a mental operation. So very quickly, let me explain it in a kind of an example of a circumstance. Say, for example, somebody that you care about insults you, and you find that insult to be thematically consistent with something that you experience quite a lot. Well, that's your schemas. And how do we change that? It's not how we respond to the person necessarily that insulted us or that we felt insulted about, but how we operate in the memory with the images of these events. So images are ourself, just like in the dream, everything in the dream is ourself. So what we're looking to do in mindfulness-based anxiety reduction is to reconcile ourselves with all the images in our mind. And we initiate that practice by learning to modulate to non-judgmental attention, so closely associated with the meditative placement of attention. So we've had a wonderful initial conversation. Let's stay with our workshop, and we'll move into the various modalities of the workshop. We'll be looking further at this non-dual perspective and learning to operate in this non-dual fashion, learning to operate within ourself, a modality of ourself that is all-inclusive. It is all-inclusive. Importantly, folks, the dual and the non-dual do not compete with one another. One is not better than the other. They are both absolutely true. It's paradox. They're both absolutely true. I am not you, and I think I function very well through that understanding. That is the dual perspective. I am also what I am looking at. I am one and the same with my environment. We are all participating We are all manifestations of that singular, all-embracing existence that is generating this remarkable and manifest reality of existence. Okay, wonderful to be with you. Tune into the coming videos and continue to practice the workshop, and we'll be going through considerable more modalities and considerable more progressions in the workshop. Good health to you, and come back soon. Thank you.